All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's installment of our summer history talks. We're so excited and so happy that you're here with us today. Just some kind of opening notes before we get started. I'm Janie Adams. I'm the History Engagement Manager for the Arizona Historical Society. I'm a staff historian, and I'm the Associate Editor of the Journal of Arizona History. A little bit about the Arizona Historical Society. AHS is a nonprofit educational and cultural institution and a state agency, and we were established in 1864. And for that 150 plus years, we've been protecting, preserving, and telling the story of Arizona's past through museum exhibitions, libraries and collections, outreach, educational programming, and through publications. Our mission statement is connecting people through the power of Arizona history. Our members love Arizona history programming. Support for programming like this comes in part from those membership dues. Members get free admission to AHS museums. They get invitations to special only members events and member pricing for programs, print copies of the Journal of Arizona History, plus online access to all of the back issues of the journal and so much more. And if you're interested in learning more about AHS membership, you can do so on our website, azhs.org/membership. Stay connected with us. Consider becoming a member, sign up for our email list, follow us on social media, maybe visit one of our museums, and you can learn about all the different things that we do at the Historical Society by visiting us online at azhs.org. A couple helpful reminders for today's session. This is a Zoom webinar, so Dr. Radding and I can't see or hear you. So if you have questions during the course of the webinar, please use the Q&A feature, and we'll get to your questions at the end of the presentation. The next talk in our series is 1 week from today, online, 12 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, Arizona time. I'm going to linger here for a second. I've got a QR code that'll take you straight to the registration for that program. But if you want to know more about this program, the next couple of programs in this series, or any other programs that are happening at the Historical Society, that information is available online on our website, on our event calendar. All right, and I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Cynthia Radding. Dr. Radding is the Gussenhoven Distinguished Professor Emerita of History and Latin American Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And her scholarship is rooted in the imperial borderlands of Spanish and Portuguese American empires, emphasizing the role of indigenous people and other colonized groups in shaping those borderlands, transforming their landscapes, and producing colonial societies. She is the past president of the Conference of Latin American History associated with the American Historical Association, and has served as book review editor of the Hispanic American Historical Review and on the editorial boards of the of the American Historical Review, the AHR, and the Americas, and on the advisory council of the Inter-American Foundation. Dr. Radding is the co-editor of the Borderlands of the Iberian World, a multi-authored Oxford University Press handbook. Her publications include Landscapes of Power and Identity, comparative histories in the Sonoran Deserts and the forests of Amazonia from colony to republic, Wandering Peoples, which is one of my favorites, Borderlands in World History, Bountiful Deserts, and so much more. Dr. Radding, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Janie, very much for that very generous introduction. Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure to join you in this Arizona Historical Society webinar. I thank Janie Adams and David Turpey for their kind invitation to contribute to the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the founding of Tucson. And I've just remembered to share my screen. I am grateful for the honor, and it is a welcome opportunity to reaffirm my ties to the peoples and landscapes of the Sonoran Desert and its surrounding environments in both Sonora and Arizona. As many of you who attend this webinar know, The history of Tucson extends back many centuries before the establishment of the military garrison there in 1775. Semi-nomadic indigenous bands of extended families who would come to be known as Tohono O'odham, Iachel, and Akimel set up their mobile rancherias or encampments along the Santa Cruz drainage, even before the Hohokam settlements built their great irrigation works in the Gila River Basin and its tributaries at the turn of the second millennium. Tucson became an O'odham village, its name evoking the black base of the outcrop known as Sentinel Mountain. As the historian of colonial Latin America, who works in the intersections of environmental history, ethnohistory, and borderland studies, the ideas I shall share with you today follow the excellent work of the Arizona Historical Society, the University of Arizona, the Southwest Mission Research Center, and the Sonora, Arizona Museum. The traditions they have established approach history from its environmental and cultural foundations, placing indigenous peoples in the center of the story. To speak of spiritual geographies and imperial borderlands, as in the title of my talk today, is to recognize the complex interweaving of human and non-human life in the Sonoran Desert, the intricate connections between geography and history, and the different ways of exercising power and endurance. As the Arizona Historical Society states proudly on its website, the geology of Arizona is as diverse as its peoples. The native peoples of northern Sonora and Arizona embrace a variety of language and tribal traditions, and it is important to recognize as well the Gueme or Yaqui towns of Guadalupe and Pascua in Arizona, in close hermandad, in close relation with their kinfolk in the Yaqui Valley of Sonora and the Yaqui barrios of Hermosillo. Spain's imperial power and the religion that came with it played a decisive role as well in building the diversity of the Sonoran and Arizona peoples. Their legacy remains in the imperial borderlands of northern Mexico and southwestern United States to the present day. Power, knowledge, and religion converge in the imperial networks that created the sinews of early modern globalization. In consonance with the historical frameworks that guide the celebration of the historical and cultural legacies of Tucson, this presentation focuses on the peoples of the Sonoran Desert, the borderlands of imperial power, and the reworking of institutions and performative expressions of spiritual power. For both Amerindian and Iberian peoples of the early modern world, the spiritual and political realms of religion were not separable. Rather, the exercise of power through ritual was closely interlaced with the institutions of local governments and of imperial rule. Set in northern New Spain, what is today northern Mexico, this presentation highlights the spiritual dimension of the shining desert as expressed by the Tohono O'odham and neighboring peoples. It places the founding of Tucson as a presidio on the borderlands of the Spanish Imperium, in an O'odham village along the Santa Cruz River drainage, within the environmental and historical contexts of the enduring peoples of the Sonoran Desert. Spatial and ecological borderlands on the frontiers of empire. Imperial borderlands evolved through military invasions, migrations, and cultural encounters as dynamic processes of ecological and social change in both time and space. Notwithstanding the violence of conquest expeditions, resource appropriation, and dislocation, the conceptual and empirical definitions of borderlands are anchored in the natural environments and the cultural landscapes of the peoples who have shaped them over many years before and after colonial intrusions. Borderlands, in this sense, evoke lived spaces rather than political boundaries. They are produced through historical processes of contestation, adaptation, and admixture among different peoples within specific time frames and geographical spaces. Borderlands do not necessarily constitute contiguous or even spaces. Rather, they can be mapped as networks for trade and transport of commercial goods, objects of sumptuary or symbolic value, and captive laborers. Indigenous pathways for cyclical and long-distance migration, sustained subsistence strategies, knowledge transfer, and community formation for centuries before European invasion. These networks defined the regional identities of northwestern Mexico, where hunter-gatherer bands of the arid plains and village farmers of the highland valleys were linked to urban trading and ceremonial centers, such as Hohokam in Arizona, Casas Grandes de Paquimé in Chihuahua, and Aztlan in western Mexico. To speak of imperial borderlands as spaces of cultural contact and networks of movement and exchange, it is interesting to ask how these interpretations of borderlands resonate with the Iberian concept of la frontera. At first inquiry, the dictionary definition of frontera does refer to the limits of a region or a political boundary. Nevertheless, in the phrase frontera enfrente, what is before or facing someone, the term becomes relational, expressing the spaces in which two or more entities face one another and implying the liminal quality of frontiers as zones of commingling and exchange. In this usage, frontera enfrente in the Hispanic tradition aligns closely with borderland in the English language for comprehending historical processes of encounter and confrontation, but also of cultural change and sharing. The 18th century imperial administration of northern New Spain designated this vast area as the interior provinces, referring to territories and peoples within the vast northern frontier that Spain claimed as its dominions in North America. Yet these interior provinces were distant from densely populated centers of Mexico at the core of the viceroyalty. Recognizing their quality of frontera enfrente, the crown created the general commandancy of the interior provinces, a military command to govern these territories and defend or extend their borders from the autonomous indigenous nations whose movements turned the frontier into a contested borderland. Spanish colonial geographies named and mapped ethnic provinces such as the Pimeria, Apacheria, or Comancheria, as we see on this map, overlaying them with the jurisdictional boundaries of bishoprics, judicial districts, or governorships. In practice, however, these entities remained loosely defined territories whose borders changed with population movements, environmental conditions, and new economic foci for extractive industries and commercial profit. They were also contingent on native strategies for food production, transhumance pastoralism, and shifting settlements. Religious institutions and actors forged cartographies for these borderlands in an attempt to bring them into the spiritual geography of frontier peoples, the lands they inhabited and through which they passed. The borderlands of imperial claims to territorial dominion in northern New Spain, in the broad swath of mountain ranges and semi-arid plains lying between the western and eastern Sierras Madres, remained largely under the control of indigenous nations who traversed these spaces and shaped their environments. This premise underlays our discussion of power and religion, beginning with the cultural geographies and historical foundations of the native peoples. Furthermore, spiritual power is closely related to the production of knowledge among different frontier peoples in their natural settings and through the cultural meetings they have created about the world about them. Landscape creation, dwelling, and knowledge production in the Sonora, Arizona borderlands. Native peoples of this region shaped diverse landscapes in 3 distinct ecological zones that were distinguished by elevation, precipitation, vegetation communities, and wildlife. The Cordillera, or the mountain ranges, rising to the escarpment of the Sierra Madre Occidental, the Piedmont, known as the Zona Serrana, the basin and range area from leading westward from the escarpment of the Sierra Madre, and the arid plains, leading to the Gulf Coast of the Gulf of California. The Tohono O'odham and the closely related Yaqued and Akimel of northern Sonora and Arizona traversed all of these ecological zones in their migratory trails and ways of dwelling on the land in different seasons of the year. Over millennia, indigenous hunter-gatherers and cultivators adapted different methods and combinations of plant cultivation, foraging, and soil and water management to the conditions of each of these zones. Their built environments and seasonal migrations created transitional spaces across mountainous ravines, Piedmont valleys, and coastal plains bordering the Gulf of California. Their mobility followed the natural morphology of stream flow, ravines, and floodplains, even as their settlements altered river currents, springs and aquifers, terraces, and alluvial valleys. They settled the landscape with communities of different sizes and degrees of permanence, creating livelihoods to support material subsistence and social reproduction. Furthermore, by developing skills with stores of knowledge about the habitats in which they lived, they forged complex and enduring cultural traditions that shaped these regional borderlands. Village dwellers of the mountainous terraces and valleys carved out their landscapes in mixed settings of semi-deciduous forests, grasslands, and tropical woods. Permanent towns alternated with rancherias, these shifting encampments, where families gathered for seasonal plantings, hunting, fishing, and foraging. Building materials ranged from stone and sun-dried mud to reed mats woven from palm leaves and agave fibers, as well as ocotillo, torote, and live oak. Highland farmers planted in narrow floodplains, small hand-watered plots, and hillside plantings dependent on rainfall. Their management of shifting cultivation required knowledge of seasonal rainfall patterns, fire management, fallowing, and crop rotation among different varieties of Mesoamerican crops. The famous trilogy of maize, squash, and pinto beans, intermingled with local species of tepary beans, devil's claw, and Mexican crucillo, among other gathered and cultivated plants that provided nutrition, medicines, fiber, and building materials. Freshwater fishing and marine life provided important sources of protein for semi-nomadic bands who relied on foraging, hunting, fishing, and ephemeral agriculture when summer rains filled the arroyos, or the dry stream beds, that crisscrossed the arid lowlands, identified with the heart of the Sonoran Desert. Extending north and west from the San Miguel and Altar Magdalena Concepcion rivers to the Gulf of California, the plains descend from the foothills of the Piedmont to sea level, but with outcroppings of low hills and truncated ranges that in the native languages are named and carry historic and religious significance. Receiving less average precipitation than the eastern highlands, but rainfall is distributed across 2 seasons, the coastal lowlands exhibit varied and often beautiful xerophytic vegetation of scrub forest, cacti, and agaves. Indigenous desert dwellers nurture and use a wide variety of species, including acacia, ironwood, palo verde, ocotillo, torote, mesquite, yucca, jojoba, gobernadora, and groves of cacti, like the Echo shown here in this photograph. Extending from the mountain slopes to the coastal plains, multiple species of agaves illustrate the adaptations of this family of plants to different environments. Agaves have evolved through mutually symbiotic relations with human communities, exemplifying complex knowledge systems and cultivation techniques that contributed to agave diversification and their geographic dispersal. Botanically and culturally, agaves have sustained human subsistence and community formation over 9 millennia across different regions of Mexico. Over the long-term co-evolution of plant communities, wildlife, and human societies, power and religion have closely adhered to culture and knowledge production. Histories of human settlement involve population growth and dispersal, territorial claims and the exercise of power, techniques for water and soil management, linkages between hunting, gathering, and gardening, and the creation of distinct cultural landscapes in different ecological settings of mountain ranges, Piedmont, and coastal lowlands. Ceremonial and defensive architecture. During approximately 5 centuries before European contact, increased population growth became evident in the size and distribution of settlements in the Piedmont valleys and highlands. Villages and hamlets were concentrated in larger towns, even as one or more urban centers with public architecture dominated key portions of river valleys. This same period exhibited intense territorial rivalries and possibly competing lineages within and across major river basins and mountain ranges. At the same time, the communities built networks of irrigation canals and clusters of residential and ceremonial spaces, numerous hilltop fortifications built with collective or directed labor to amass rock walls and earthen terraces appeared throughout the region. These built terraces, like the one shown here, called trincheras, signaled both a form of ceremonial architecture and a defensive strategy. In the cultural and political contexts of demographic growth, agricultural expansion, and greater social complexity, the terraces marked spatial boundaries to defend territory, mount lookouts over valleys, and claim control over resources. Conflicts of this nature complicated native responses to the Spanish invasions of the 16th century. Imperial power and the reconstruction of indigenous cosmologies. Christianity, of the Roman Catholic observance, entered the Spanish colonies of North America under the banner of Iberian imperialism. The Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, brought the evangelizing mission to northwestern New Spain according to the formula of Patronato Real. Through royal patronage, the Spanish state, under the rule of the monarch, supported the missions economically, and it negotiated agreements with the papacy to oversee the founding and administration of missions, as well as authorize the missionaries who served in the indigenous communities of the Iberian colonies. In northwestern New Spain, the Jesuits arrived in 1591 to begin the mission enterprise throughout the provinces of Sinaloa, Ostimuri, and Sonora, including Arizona, along the Cordillera and Piedmont of the Sierra Madre Occidental. Empowered by royal patronage and imbued with the zeal of the Catholic Counter-Reformation and biblical evangelizing mission, the Jesuits undertook religious conversion with the objective of effecting cultural, social, and economic changes in the native communities in the name of both God and King. In practice, however, they depended on native leaders to bring semi-itinerant bands into the settled villages that would become the mission towns and to undertake the processes of doctrinal interpretation. In the Sonora, Arizona borderlands, the mission enterprise required persistent negotiation with Native communities and the colonial society that developed around them. The ecological and cultural practices of Indigenous peoples conditioned the mission's size, ethnic composition, and duration. Even more profoundly, missionaries intruded on the spiritual domains of shamanism. For Native peoples, spiritual power that arose from their natural environments entered the bodies and souls of shamans, or traditional healers, individuals who received these gifts to bring healing and prophetic knowledge, or conversely, to inflict illness, hardship, and death. Shamans possess the ability to transcend the boundaries between nature and culture, to interpret dreams, and to transform themselves into animal-like and spiritual beings. In the fragile and porous sinews of these colonial frontiers, priests and shamans held parallel roles and often confronted one another. Historically, then, religious conversion did not signify displacement. Rather, it evolved as a selective reconfiguration of Native practices and spiritual geographies. Native adaptations of Catholicism attempted to reconcile Christian imagery and ritual to the shamanic powers and spiritual landscapes of forest clearings, caves, mountains, and natural springs. People of the shining desert. The Tohono O'odham have crafted landscapes for the material dwelling and spiritual renewal in the plains and low ranges of the Sonoran Desert for centuries, adapting their seasonal migrations to the availability of water and the distribution of a wide range of plants and wildlife. Even in the exigencies of modern life, the O'odham espouse a concept of wilderness, Diojkam, signifying health, wholeness, and the renewal of life. Qualities that are nurtured through rituals, customary limits for hunting, and selective planting. Spiritual power adheres to the desert and specific sites, like Kitobak, a spring-fed lagoon that becomes sacred to the ritual of Vikita, a gathering of extended families to reenact stories, dances, and songs that call forth the life-giving rains to support hunting, foraging, and the short summer planting season when the arroyos won. O'odham narratives revere the Babokivari mountain, the spiritual center of their creator, Iitoi, and evoke their territorial boundaries and pathways to the Gulf of California and the Colorado River Delta. Tohono O'odham spiritualities, rooted in the shining desert, encountered Catholic sacramental rituals of salvation through the Jesuit missions that reached northern Sonora in the last third of the 17th century. While maintaining their migratory patterns through the Sonoran Desert, the Tohono O'odham entered the missions along the Magdalena, Altar, Concepcion valleys. They worked in the pueblos during the planting and harvest seasons, where they observed Christian liturgies of baptism, confession, communion, marriage, and burial. Traversing the mixed environments of agricultural villages, wind, rain, and animal spirits continue to inform shamanic curing practices in the tradition of O'odham Himdag, the people's way. O'odham notions of health and sickness, good and evil, developed parallel traditions of shared symbolism and moral values, but separated spatially in their ritual performances. Santo Himdag, the saintly way, drew its strength from Catholic missionization, centered in chapels, roadside crosses, and home altars. In contrast, Jaul Himdag, the devil's way, from Diablo in Spanish, fused Christian notions of evil with the O'odham concepts of dangerous spiritual forces that emanated from the desert or from the misuse of shamanic powers. Jawal Himdag was perceived in different forms of staying sickness related to irreverent or harmful actions against animals, particularly livestock and horses. These illnesses required shamanic diagnosis and remedial cures. O'odham Saint Way and Devil Way developed as processes of cultural sharing and adaptation that borrowed selectively from Imperial Catholic institutions and pre-contact shamanic traditions. Their complex histories of selective adaptation drew on the colonial missions and reflected the experiences of wage labor and peonage in mines and ranches, continuing into the modern period. Moreover, these interrelated paths of O'odham Himdag reflect the cultural importance of livestock as property and as a symbol of ceremonial intercession between humans and nature, parallel to the importance of wildlife for hunting and the ritual of Vikita for renewing the life-giving powers of the desert. Temples, saints, and the symbols of spiritual geographies. Over 3/4 of a century, from 1687 to 1767, the Jesuits established 20 missions in the Acimel villages of the Pimeria Alta, extending from Caborca in the west to Cocospre in the east. This broad interethnic borderland formed the northern tip of the Jesuit mission enterprise that encompassed the present-day states of Durango, Chihuahua, Nayarit, Sinaloa, Sonora, and Baja California in Mexico, and Arizona in the United States. Following the Jesuits' forced departure in 1767 by order of King Charles III, the missions of Pimeria Alta were assigned to the Franciscans of the Missionary College of Querétaro, the College of the Holy Cross in Querétaro. Under their purview, the mission villages were maintained by the indigenous families who lived in them and cared for their buildings, crops, and livestock for another half-century into the Mexican national period. The churches whose colonial architecture we admire today, and that continue to operate as thriving parishes, were built by native craftsmen, largely under the Franciscan administration of 1768 to 1840. At the center of this mission frontier, the axis running from San Javier del Bac and its sister village of Tucson, southward through San Jose de Tumacacori and its sister village of Huevabe, to San Ignacio de Caburica and Magdalena, is emblematic of the spiritual geographies of the Pimeria Alta and the layered cosmologies of Santo Himdag, the moral path of Saints' Way for the O'odham peoples. The trails leading upriver, but south, along the Santa Cruz drainage, from Bac southeast into the San Ignacio and Magdalena River valleys, marked a transition between the ecological and cultural settings of the Yahed, Tohono O'odham, and Acimel ways of dwelling on the land. Travelers along these trails passed through gradual changes from semi-arid desert vegetation and intermittent arroyos to farming villages along permanent streams. This continuum of landscapes and closely related ethnic peoples was crossed by the U.S.-Mexico border, created in 1854, following the Treaty of the Mesilla or the Gadsden Purchase. Despite this increasingly militarized political boundary, religious pilgrimage destined for Magdalena each year for the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, recorded since the 19th century and continuing to the present, reaffirm the continuities of culture, history, and spiritual power that sustain this borderland. San Javier del Bac constituted the northernmost mission founded by the Jesuits at the close of the 17th century. Bac, meaning where water rises to the surface, anchored this mission and its sister village of Tucson in a wide floodplain of the Santa Cruz Basin, the beautiful church and convent that continue to welcome visitors today were completed in 1797. This church is nearly identical to the construction in Caborca, Sonora, completed in the following decade. San Jose de Tumacacuri, some 40 miles south of San Javier del Bac, formed part of a cluster of 4 villages gathered into the mission of Our Lady of Sorrows of Huevavi under Jesuit tutelage. They straddled a fertile valley within the Santa Cruz drainage. Over time, Tumacacuri became the principal mission town, absorbing families from the other 3 villages. It has persisted through the Mexican national period and United States annexation into modern historical times. Tumacacuri remains as a monument to the cultural encounters and commingling in the Pimería Alta under the dedicated care of the United States National Park Service. Santa Maria Magdalena was renamed Magdalena de Quino in honor of Jesuit Francisco Eusebio Quino, who founded the initial mission settlements of Pimería Alta and who was buried in a small chapel in Magdalena upon his death in 1711. Originally, this was the smaller Visita, dependent on the mission town of San Ignacio. But Magdalena gradually overtook its head village in population and economic resources, due in part to the growing importance of the annual pilgrimages that centered on Magdalena, coming from both the north and the south. Magdalena's changing name and fortunes point as well to the merging religious symbolism focused on the Jesuit Saint Francis Xavier, one of the founders of the Society of Jesus, Saint Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan order, and the missionary Francisco Eusebio Quino, who has become an icon in both Sonora and Arizona. Focused on October 4th, the day devoted to Saint Francis of Assisi in the Catholic liturgical calendar, the events surrounding his feast day in Magdalena may well rest on an O'odham harvest festival. They combine the religious observance in the church, venerating Saint Francis Xavier, a visit to the tomb of Quino, and a feria, a public fair, including the sale of healing herbs, art crafts, blankets, and the mingling of extended families arriving from the Yaqui and Mayo valleys in Sonora, as well as from northern Sonora and Arizona, and returning migrants who join their families at this fiesta. The long history of the missions in the Pimería Alta, as in northern New Spain more broadly, was not always peaceful. Internal tensions brewed within mission villages, arising from missionaries' attempts to impose doctrinal standards, but mainly from the subsistence crises arising from epidemics, droughts, and crop failures. When mission crops failed to sustain the village's population, then O'odham families returned to the desert. Mission towns were distributed along the river basins and the terraces that rose above them, but interspersed with Spanish branches and haciendas. To the east, in the foothills leading to the Sierra Madre Occidental, colonial mining ventures demanded indigenous labor. These labor demands that often drew workers out of the mission towns, and Spanish encroachments on indigenous cropland and semi-arid thorn forest for livestock grazing created conflicts across the region. 2 major rebellions occurred in 1695 and 1751 in the Pimería Alta, sweeping through mission towns and Spanish settlements. They both seriously challenged Spanish imperial dominion in the region and put into question the entire mission enterprise. The establishment of the military garrison in the presidio of Tubac across the river from Mission to Macacuri in 1752 and its subsequent move to Tucson in 1775 came in response to these uprisings in the context of increasing raids on the missions and Spanish settlements by Apaches and other autonomous bands beyond the imperial frontier. Nonetheless, the missions and the peoples endured. Power, religion, and nature. To summarize, power, knowledge, and religion converged in the spiritual cosmologies of Amerindian peoples in the imperial borderlands of Spanish America. In northern New Spain, practical ecological knowledge of rivers, forests, savannas, and arid lands that was transferred across generations supported indigenous livelihoods and forged durable linkages between nature and human societies. That same knowledge of the natural environment provided the mythical beings and moral concepts that people their cosmologies, restored balance among the forces of nature, and empowered shamanic healers while governing the limits of their transgressive flights. Indigenous peoples expressed their reverence for spiritual power in nature, as exemplified by the admonitions of Santo Himdag and Juawul Himdag among the Tohono O'odham of Sonora and Arizona. Religious rituals undergirded the social bonds of kinship and reciprocal obligations, and reinforced a sense of belonging in the communities of both provinces. Spiritual power was evoked just as forcefully, however, in the political rivalries that spurred violent episodes of warfare in the pursuit of territory, resources, and the subjugation of alien or enemy peoples. Religion permeated all of these areas of contestation, conflict, and the reconciliation of opposing forces. Iberian imperialism raised the threshold of conflict, bringing new technologies for economic production, violent conquest, and ritual performance in the borderlands and interstices of powerful domains. The spiritual geographies of native peoples who dominated these spaces for most of the colonial period, even in the face of imperial claims to hegemony, were transformed by Catholicism, but they were not displaced. Rituals and knowledge traditions of both Christianity and traditional healers underwent processes of transculturation in the historical construction of cosmologies that accounted for the wounds inflicted by imperialism, as well as the enduring creative forces of nature and the renewal of life. I will close by reading a stanza from the poem by Ofelia Cepeda, an O'odham educator, scholar, and activist. The poem is entitled Suitcase of Saints, from her collection Ocean Power, Poems from the Desert. There is no saint's table in his house. There is not even a crucifix on the wall. No candle was burning. He said, I keep the key to the old church. Every Sunday, I go to the old church to pray. And when they have Mass in the new church, I go there too. So I have no need for saints, candles, or crucifix in my house. One day, he found a valise, an old suitcase, in a wash by the roadside. After some hesitation, I opened the latch. Inside it were saint statues, all kinds. There was the Virgin of Guadalupe, a Santo Niño, the Holy Family, Saint Francis, Saint Martin, Saint Peter, the Virgin Mary, and Christ. There were strands of rosary, all shapes, colors, and colored ribbons, the kind from Magdalena. Now in a different voice. And then there was another time. Oh yes, we were the best Catholics. We walked from Ajo to Hilaben to Yuma and places in between. We walked to Quitobac and down to Rocky Point. And all the while, we carried an extra suitcase just for the saints. These voices express different approaches to spirituality and attitudes toward the Catholic saints. Yet the imagery is grounded in place in the spiritual geographies of the wider Sonoran Desert. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Radding. So as questions are kind of trickling in, I'm going to give folks a second to get their questions typed in. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to this work?
Well, largely I came to this work through the really long and important professional experience I had in the regional center of the Mexican National Institute of Anthropology and History in Sonora. And in the close association during those years that we had with a number of colleagues and institutions in Arizona, first and foremost, the University of Arizona and the Arizona Historical Society at that time. We did a number of publications together, and by virtue of living in Sonora, even in the urban environment of Hermosillo, having come from Eastern United States, I know that my interest in environmental history was really strengthened by the great impression of the desert climate, the heat, the landscape, and the beauty of the desert, both the desert and the mountainous region that I was able to enjoy at that time.
So one of the first questions that we have is asking about kind of maybe some more kind of discussion about the compatibility between Catholicism and indigenous regions of the area. And I think I had the opportunity when I was an undergraduate student to go on the pilgrimage to Magdalena, and I it was such a transformative experience, even though I was a lay Catholic at the time. But it was such an important experience and so regional in its kind of celebration. So if you could speak a little bit more on that.
Well, there certainly are divergencies. We have to admit this between Catholicism and native religions. But I am keenly aware, both for Tohono O'odham and for the kinds of sort of hybrid religious celebrations that we see in also in Sonoran Mexican towns. But I'm very, very aware of this with the Tohono O'odham. I was able to witness Vikita on one occasion, and the repeated visits that I have made to the Yueme or Yaqui and Yureme or Mayo towns of southern Sonora. It is very, very clear, and this is why I talk about hybrid or reconstructed cosmologies. The indigenous peoples have taken Catholicism and embraced Catholicism. They are deeply religious, and what is seen especially in the very powerful Lenten and Easter celebrations is this combination of symbolism from animals, of traditional dances, songs, taking elements from nature, like the particular moth cocoons that form the special musical instruments that are worn by dancers around their legs, the use of gourds and wooden sticks for percussion, combined with instruments like violins and harps. There is very much a very complex and rich combination of traditions. And as I have written elsewhere, particularly in Landscapes of Power and Identity, these are not in any way infantilized or cheapened expressions of Catholicism. Rather, they are very sophisticated, very complex, joining together of cosmologies. Partly, as I said at the end of my talk, to deal with the wounds and the complexities of imperialism, but also to reaffirm the endurance of the people. I hope that answers what is a very good question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of related to that, what was the reaction of kind of church officials, colonial officials at the time, and has that reaction kind of changed over time to, for lack of a better word, the folk Catholicism of the region?
Yeah, well, also, I wanted to preface what I said by saying that Catholicism itself, even Catholicism practiced in Europe, was not uniform, was also very complex. However, the church authorities often did react with incomprehension and repression, although at the same time they accepted certain indigenous celebrations. One of them, which we know throughout northwestern Mexico, is the Matachines, also New Mexico. In fact, the Jesuits brought this as a kind of moros y cristianos, as a kind of drama of conquest. But the indigenous peoples turned it around and made it into a celebration, a kind of a dance, a ritual dance that features Saint Michael as the protector of the Virgin, often presented as the Virgin of Guadalupe, and the dancing by men and boys in the atrium of the church turns that space into sacred space. So and this is something that I found described in 18th century colonial documents. So this was one manifestation of this kind of complex hybrid cosmology that missionaries were able to accept. But there also was a lot of hostility to this. And as I said, the missionaries' attempt to impose doctrinal standards or orthodoxy was one motive for indigenous rebellions.
Absolutely. A related question to that is kind of thinking kind of outside of this region. How does this compare with other areas that experienced Spanish missionization?
Oh, that's a great question. And again, in Landscapes of Power and Identity, I constructed that book as a comparative history of northwestern New Spain or northwestern Mexico and eastern lowland Bolivia. There I concentrated on the province of Chiquitos in lowland Bolivia that borders on Brazil. And I found some interesting, these both were Jesuit mission provinces. They both were provinces that were economically connected to the major mining regions of both viceroyalties, but they were in very different geographical settings. Lowland Bolivia is subtropical and northwestern Mexico is semi-arid. But I also found these kinds of mixed cosmologies drawing on, in the case of Chiquitos, drawing on water sources, their notion of hichis, who are sort of spirits that dominate natural springs and places where water rises to the surface, also combined with very rich Catholic architecture and Catholic symbolism. And some of our viewers may know that that area of eastern Bolivia, the Chiquitos missions themselves and the city of Santa Cruz are now at the center of a very vibrant music festival that draws on the Catholic musical traditions of the colonial period, and that draws in people performing small choirs and groups from Mexico, the United States, Europe, and Venezuela and other parts of the Americas.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Radding, for your time today. I really appreciate you sharing your work with us, the significance of environmental history, the significance of religious history, in addition to kind of thinking about kind of larger, perhaps better studied histories of military conquest, I think is so important.
Well, thank you, and I thank all of our viewers for staying with us.
Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day and take care.
Thank you, Janie, very much.
Bye.